Okay, we are live. So good morning and welcome everybody to the Creative Academy with me. I am Eileen Cook and we are here for our Tuesday morning happy hour. And today we are tackling a topic that came to us via Bonnie with an E, so that we don't confuse our two Bonnies. And for some reason, Bonnie felt like this was my fault, which I completely disagree with. But Bonnie is in the process of writing a book and wondering if her book is starting to become actually what should be two different books. So I'm actually going to have you turn your mic on, Bonnie, and tell us just kind of what you've been struggling with a little bit.
Well, first of all, I don't think it's your fault. I was just teasing. I was just doing what you said, and it made the book better.
I'll take that fault.
I had to find the problem with it. Well, first, by building in more conflict and getting to know my characters better, things do tend to bloat or expand a bit. But when I went to, I passed the halfway point, and when I went to look at what was left to revise, and I read all my little scene cards on all the things that were happening, I was like, oh crap, that's a lot of stuff happening. That might be a whole nother book. So I went from 55 to 65,000 words. Now I'm at 94,000 words, and I'm only halfway through, but that's counting the rest of the book because I did write it. This is the second draft. But I expect it'll be closer to the 100, 120 if I can rein it in. But a part of me is like, well, do I really need to rein it in? A lot of this is very interesting story. I feel like I'm building more depth to my characters, and they have more subplots have somehow crept in with all this conflict stuff. And so I can actually see a way to separate it. I just don't know if I should just keep going and then see afterwards. I'll either have to trim or if I should actually kind of strategize as to where would be a good spot to break, and what would that involve, and how does that change how I plotted things.
Perfect. All right. Well, I think this is a really useful topic to talk about because I think it's actually fairly common that people go through this sort of challenge. In particular, if you're writing something like a fantasy novel that has this tendency to expand. And I also know, for example, Cynthia has looked at doing, I think, a series, right? So the middle grade that she's been working on with our, Fearless Max is sort of intended that it could be an ongoing series with Max. So it's good to sort of start thinking about what does that look like. So when I do post office hours, I'm going to put a couple links. So I found a couple really nice articles through Writer's Edit and also through New York Book Editors. And I like their posts quite a bit. So rather than repeat everything that they say, I'm going to kind of just direct you to that. But I also just made some notes that I think are useful for us to talk about. And as I go along, if anything I'm saying doesn't make sense, just raise your hand, unless you're Bonnie with an I, in which case your camera's not on. So you'd actually have to put it in the chat window, or I will have no idea that you've raised your hand. Okay. So I think the first most important thing that I took from the articles that I was skimming through, and also having called a couple of friends who write fantasy and wanting to know their thoughts, is that ultimately it comes down to a gut check moment. So there's a moment where you have to decide, this is something that is 2 books, or this is something that is, 3 or more books, or this is, in fact, should be condensed down to 1. So one example that I can give is I did an edit project on a historical novel that takes place during the Viking years. And when she initially sent it to me, it was 1 book, and it was 212,000 words. So it was long. That's what it was. And so we actually had a big talk, because to me there was a natural break in the story where you could have divided, these are the things that happen under, it doesn't really matter, but Eric the Red under this Viking, and then these are the things that happen to this other primary Viking. But in talking about it, I really felt, um, and she really felt compelled. It was the secondary character, the person who takes over for her, which was about 1/3 of the book, that was the character that the story really sang about. Like the other stuff was really interesting and fun and different, but I felt like that story had been told. Not that I'm some huge Viking expert, for clarity, but it felt for me like that was something that I had read before. But her other story, which was about actually a female Viking, was fascinating and clearly well researched and all of this stuff. So she had two things that she was challenged with. Was she ended up deciding to trust her instinct and to make it one book. But it meant doing, when I say a lot of cutting, I mean a lot of cutting. We're talking cutting almost half of what she had written and trying to figure out then what was actually essential to that story. And part of the challenge for her was she loves all the story and she wants to share all of that with the rest of you. The second part is she had done so much valuable research. So she actually did a 3-week tour on a Viking boat. So she knows how the sails work. She knows how you cook on a Viking boat. She knows how all this stuff happened. She went actually, over to Iceland and Norway and all these various places and did all this tremendous research. And she's fascinated by it. And when I was reading it initially, I was also fascinated by it because what do I know about a Viking ship? And the whole point I read is to learn stuff. But the problem was, while it was interesting, it wasn't moving the story forward. So it was finding a balance of what is the flavor or the interest part that's going to make that story really pop, and what in fact could go or could be trimmed way down. So I don't actually need a treatise on how to sail a Viking ship because I'm not ever going to do that. What I need is enough details that I have the sense that she completely knows how to sail a Viking ship and that it gives me that feeling. So again, one of the biggest articles talked about trusting your gut. And the second part of that came through loud and clear was know your genre expectations. Because there are, of course, certainly books that are more lean towards series. So certainly fantasy is something that leans towards series. Certainly there are a lot of middle grade or mysteries, again, where you have a reoccurring character. And that also then kind of takes us into how do books get broken down. So there are a couple of different ways that you might look at. So what you sometimes will see would be something like what I might call the Games of Thrones example, where you have one huge overarching story that is taking place over, I think he's at 7 books now, but I'm going to say 7, and then someone's going to be like, no, it's 12 or whatever. But you can see I watched the TV show and not the books. But what he's done is he's, taken one story and it's a continuing story that's happening over this huge amount of things, but it's broken up into different pieces. So there's always a satisfying end to one piece of this story, but the overarching story is another. The other is more what I think Cynthia might be doing for her middle grade, which is the kind of thing where you have a reoccurring main character, but each book is sort of a standalone adventure. So there are definitely things that are continuing, but it's very consistent. This is what you see in a lot of mysteries. So if you liked, the A is for alibi, B is for burglar series, you're following that same detective, and each book was a separate case. So you're seeing that kind of opportunity to come up where you're telling a complete story, but you almost could read those in any order. If you read, and I don't remember what K is for killer. I remember what it was. There'd be parts where you wouldn't necessarily appreciate certain things because there might be a joke about a secondary character or a flashback to something. But on the whole, you could read those books out of order and find them very satisfying and enjoyable. Game of Thrones, if you read that out of order, I have no idea how that would ever make sense to you, but that would be something you can do. The sort of third option for a series is where you have some kind of connected world. And you'll see this a lot in romance. So this is actually what Crystal is doing. For those of you that follow Crystal, is she has a town, Rivers Run, and she has different romance stories that are happening to different characters. And they're all people in this town. So again, someone might show up in book 2 or 3 that was the main character, but the book that she's writing about now it's the romance for a different character. They're just sort of secondary or tertiary characters. So sometimes you'll see series where it's the same world. And in that same category, I would put what might come up for Bonnie, which is it's the same world, but different slices of that world. So you might see almost like a prologue story. So this is what happened in this world at this other time. Here's a main story. And then you may have another story like, you know, in story A, we were all focused on the dragons. And now I'm going to give you the story that was happening in this other part of this world. So they all fit together nicely. And for the reader, it's kind of fun to go back and revisit that world or that town if you're writing Crystal's book. But again, they're fairly standalone. So one thing to start thinking about is, okay, well, what am I going to do? With the different genres, of course, you have different options. And I'm always very reluctant to give kind of word count targets because I think we get crazy about them. And let's be honest, as writers, we're pretty comfortable being crazy. But I think it is useful to have some idea. So I want to kind of walk through just a few things to think about. So if you're writing middle grade, you're going to see that middle grade typically comes in between sort of 20,000, and it has often the widest range because you'll see it go up to 60,000. And the 60,000 does tend to be that much older middle grade. But you're much more likely to see, I would say the sweet spot to be is somewhere in that 30 to 40,000 range. You're in a pretty good spot for a middle grade. But that'll give you an idea there. If you're writing YA, again, you're going to see a range. But typically you're going to see most YA come in between sort of 65 and say 90,000. With an exception, fantasy. And with fantasy, you will see fantasy often ramping up to 120,000. So that'll give you an idea there. If you're writing an adult novel and you're writing something I would call contemporary or sort of mainstream fiction, again, you're going to see most things around that 100,000. But you'll see like something like a Sophie Kinsella shopaholic book. Those were all around 70,000 to 80,000. They were shorter. So you can definitely start, if you even just look on the shelf, there'll be certain books you can tell. These books are less likely to be large. So what makes for a larger book? Like, how do you know if you have a larger book or you just have book bloat? That's a really hard question to answer. Certainly, certain things are going to add to a length of a book. So if you are doing a novel that has multiple character points of view, so you are writing, is it Pretty Little Big Lies? What was that? It made it into a TV show, that one, like where there's 5 different characters that are all telling a piece of their story. That typically is going to add to the length of a book. If you're writing a book that's going to require significant world building, I don't know, for example, if you had dragons, and you have to explain a magic system and you have to explain how that works and what's real and what's not real, that's going to take more time. If you are writing a historical novel, so you are writing Lincoln's Dressmaker, Mrs. Lincoln's Dressmaker, whatever that book is, you're going to have to, again, write significantly more because you have to set the scene for the reader because they're not going to know it. If you're writing contemporary, you get a lot of things, for lack of a better term, for free. So if I'm writing about a character and I say she's walking down a suburban high school with posters for the game and a cheerleader on every corner, pretty quickly people are going to be able to picture because we all have that reference frame for a suburban high school. So what I'm thinking of might be slightly different than what you're thinking of, but it's going to be close enough that the story will make sense. If you're writing, obviously, fantasy, you don't get to have that because if you say we're at the dragon school, I need a little more to go on because I have no set established parameter for dragon school. So someone like Kirsten gets to ride the middle ground. Because what Kirsten's going to have is she's going to have a lot of things that come for free because in many ways her story is set in this real world place. It's just a real world place where every so often there's magic and there are things that are happening. So she'll be somewhere in the middle of those things. So that can sometimes help a little bit. So you're thinking about, what are my, genre expectations? What are publishers thinking about? Why do they, what word count are they sort of expecting to see? If you turn in a book that is 200,000 words, you're going to probably hit a bump. That is not to say, and as soon as I say that, someone's going to be like, but wait, what about XYZ book? And there are certainly plenty of books that are out there, but they are sort of expectations about what they're expecting to see. In the same way, if you say, I've written an epic fantasy that comes in at 60,000 words, their eyebrows are also going to go up, because they're going to wonder, how in the world did you manage an epic fantasy in 60,000 words? Like, there's no way to do that. So they're going to have their doubts and questions about that. I do want to put a tiny plug in around why publishers have those expectations. So sometimes people say, and I come under this, I love me a good fat book. Like, I almost feel like when I'm at the bookstore, if it's a thin book, because I know that I read really fast, I almost feel cheated, right? Like, this is only going to take me a day. And it costs maybe the same as this book by Ken Follett that will take me at least a week to read, because it's huge and fat. So there are a lot of people who say, but I like big fat books. Like, why don't publishers want big fat books? And actually, this is one of those ugly moments where we understand that writing is a craft, but publishing is a business. And so what that kind of comes down to is paper costs money. So the larger the book, the larger the cost for that book. And there's only so much they can raise the price before readers start to balk. So you'll actually see often big fat books are not necessarily that much more expensive than tiny skinny books. So for them, if they are publishing a big fat book, printing costs are going to be higher. Second thing that's going to be higher is shipping costs. So keep in mind, though many of you guys might be a huge fan of ebooks, and a lot of people certainly are fans of ebooks, the vast majority of sales at this time are still happening in print. So it does vary from genre to genre. It's much higher in romance, for example. But I think if you look at publishing as a whole, the last stat I saw was around 70 to 72% of books are still being bought in print, which means they have to be shipped. And if a book has to be shipped, that has a cost. And if I can fit 20 copies of your book in a box, that's one cost. If I can only get 15 copies of your book in that box and the store wants 20, that means I'm shipping 2 boxes. And the next piece, which again has to do with print and dealing with those kinds of things, is picture your local Barnes & Noble or your local Indigo. The fatter the book, the more shelf space it is in fact taking. So if I want to have 4 copies of Ken Follett's new book, which is going to be that thick, that's taking the place of maybe 2 different books. So bookstores are constantly doing that. And that's one of the challenges with print that you're always dealing with, is that you're potentially getting pushed off the shelf by new books. So booksellers in a lot of ways are looking for books that fit in that kind of perfect sweet spot again of, that big, not that big. So that's why that's coming. So now some things to think about if you are in fact making this decision for yourself, and it's around, what am I going to do? So the first question is figuring out, do I in fact have 2 books, or is this something that's going to get cleaned up in the revision process? So those of you who know me, so I think Cynthia and Bonnie with an E have heard me on this before, but the rest of you may not. So stay tuned, the 2 of you. I believe that most writers fall into one or 2 camps. You either write long or you write short. And by that, I mean, if you write short, and I'm going to put myself in that category, when I write a draft, it tends to be quite lean. And in fact, my final version is usually much longer than my initial draft, because it's only when I'm revising that I realize, like, oh, I never actually described that space, or I want to give much more emotional depth to this scene, or these things need to be in there. So I'm tending to, as I'm revising, adding things in and adding subplots in, and in fact, then making my book much longer. But I think the default is actually the opposite. I think most people fall into a category of what I would call writing long. And by that, I mean that they're figuring out the story as they're writing, and they're writing things that are coming into their head. And it's only when they have a completed draft that they're going back and figuring out, oh, this thing can come out. I don't actually need this. And certainly the most common example of writing long is when people find that they have written 4 chapters at the beginning that they don't actually need, that the story actually starts on page 50, but they were kind of writing their way into the story. Or they will have, long periods of flashback because they're coming to understand that character and they're really interested in this character's backstory. And so they have this long scene where we see A, B, or C happen, which is interesting, but it's not moving the story forward, right? Anytime you have a flashback, what you're actually doing is putting your novel in reverse, which is not a bad thing. Even in a car, sometimes we have to back up to go someplace. But certainly in your car, you don't want to make the bulk of the journey in reverse. So every time you're adding a flashback, you're taking the reader off the initial story and moving them back and then coming back to rejoin the story. So sometimes what you find out is, you know what, I don't actually need all those flashbacks. It's just important to know this thing happened to this character, and therefore they're moving on from that point. So you can worry about that at a later time. So welcome, Leslie. We're just talking about how if you can figure out if your story is actually 2 or more books. So one of the things you may have to do, and I say this knowing that what I'm saying is very unpleasant, if you're not sure, you may have to write the whole damn thing. So a lot of people are like, well, if I could just know now, then I will set it up to write 2 books, or I will do this. But sometimes you can know earlier, but sometimes you actually just have to go through the process and write the whole thing. And then once you write it and have had the chance to be like, did I cut out what didn't need to be there? Wait, actually this stuff does need to be expanded. I want to broach this into 2 books. So you can sort of do that. It's good to remember that a series is not just one giant book divided into different parts. Right? So readers, these are not you can't leave someone tied to the train tracks and then be like, okay, in our next installment. So you will leave things hanging. There will be, parts of the story that are pulling the reader in, but each individual book has to stand alone on its own. So the reader has to find reading that book satisfying. And I think this is what most series struggles with. I don't know if anyone has a favorite series that they read, but one example that I hear a lot is like if you liked the Hunger Games series, which of course was hugely popular YA series, book 1 was explosive. And then book 2 had a little bit of kind of a squishy middle. Like it was not quite as strong. And then she kind of wrapped up the story again, much stronger with the 3rd and final book, which I think is often a challenge for a writer is that middle part of the story does tend to be the squishy bit. So you still have to find something in that centerpiece that finishes that off. So we lost one of our Bonnies, or we're losing our Bonnie, but good to see her. So you have to sort of figure out how are you going to divide that. So one thing to think about is there a natural space where you've had some kind of triumph, where this part of the story has come to an end and you can end there where there's a victory, but there are still things ongoing. So that may be a thing. So if you look at like the Star Wars movies and you go back, so the very first Star Wars movie, that they've triumphed, right? They have blown up the Death Star, but they're also very clear that Darth Vader has gotten away. And that it is by no means that the rebellion has won. Like they have won this battle. But it's a very satisfying place to end that story. So it tends to work a little bit better that way. Or you might think about, is there a way to divide the story into different threads? And this may be what Bonnie ends up doing, where there is a story that is an early version of what's happening, then a current version, or like you might realize like, oh, I have I was planning to do multiple characters, but maybe one book is this character's point of view, and the next book is this other character's point of view because I want to do that. So you can start thinking about, how would I divide that up? And then part of that is, if you are going to divide it up, making sure then that you have enough meat, that you just don't have too thin stories. So that may mean that you need to add extra subplots. So yay, which is my favorite thing to do. And Bonnie's laughing because I'm like, we could add this, we could add that. But you start asking the questions. My favorite question, of course, being, what would make this worse? How can we add to that? And that is, in fact, then what you would want to start doing is, if you decide like, okay, I had 3 characters. I had Jane, Ken, and Eileen. And my intention was it was going to be a rotating point of view of these 3 different characters. But now I realize they each need their own story. Then you have to make sure that each of those characters has a full story. The next thing I'm going to suggest is, if you are intending to write a series, what you're going to want to start thinking about is, how are you going to track and find some way to organize all of this information? Because readers will actually keep track of this stuff, right? So they will remember, if you said in book 1 that Cynthia's teacher was named Marianne, and in book 5 you say Cynthia's teacher is named Leslie, they're going to be like, what happened to Marianne? Where'd she go? So you're going to need some way to do that. Crystal certainly has highlighted in the past, and we can ask her again. She has a lot of tools that can sort of help you keep what I would call a series Bible, of some way of tracking that. If you are low tech, so there is nothing, if you guys don't know Crystal already, there is nothing that woman loves more than a spreadsheet and a software program. And any question you ask her, she will have one for you. I tend to love these things and then buy them and then never actually use them. That's my mode of operation with those. So I've now finally learned not to buy them. So when I did my 4th grade fairy series, what I did is I bought a 3-ring binder. Stay tuned, this is high tech. I bought a 3-ring binder and some paper and some like dividers. And I had characters, plots, and I had different sections. And as I wrote stuff, I just made sure I kept notes about what those things were, so that rather than having to scroll through an entire manuscript to be like, did I ever say what her brother's name was? Scroll, 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 scroll. I could just go in and I had a list of characters. So anytime I added a character, I put a line in that binder with them, and I put any detail. So if I mentioned that they had a squeaky voice or that they always wore the color blue, I just made a note of that, because odds that I would remember it were slim. And the last piece of advice or thing I want to talk about before we jump in with questions or any of those things is to think about your timing. So if you are thinking or planning to go traditional, keep in mind that publishers are going to want books to come out about a year apart. So if you are thinking this is an epic fantasy and it's going to take me years to write, you might want to get ahead of that game a little bit. And that's, a publisher will wait. It's not that a publisher is going to demand a book. If it's not ready, it's not ready. But the challenge is for readers. And I don't know if anyone else has had this experience, but you read the first book in a series and you love it. And so you are counting down the days and stalking the author's, website. You pre-order it the day it comes out. It comes out, it's now been a year and a half, and you realize you have absolutely no real memory of what was in book 1. So you have to go back and reread book 1. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I'm becoming painfully aware that there's only so much time in this life and therefore only so many books to be read. So I get rather resentful when I have to reread a book in order to continue. And so what you can see is that people will either A, wait until a series is completely out to start it. The challenge with that for the publisher is if they don't know that you're planning to read the entire series once it's out, they may cancel the series a few books in, and probably everyone can think of a series that they enjoyed where it never finished because the publisher dropped the series at some point because the sales numbers weren't sufficient. And then later, as people do pick it up, they're like, but now I want the rest of it. And it's like, well, now that's not necessarily going to happen. So that's something to consider if you're going traditional. If you're doing indie publishing, of course, the world's your oyster. Do whatever you like. But what you're going to find is the same principle holds, if not more so. I think with indie publishing, they're really expecting that book probably anywhere from 3 to 6 months apart, and no more than that. So they are, I think, to some degree, a more demanding audience with that. And so what you will often see is writers who will pre-plan for that. One of the things, there are many things that impress me about Crystal, but one of the things that impressed me is when she began to write her River's End series, and we were talking about it, she did so much pre-planning because she knew she wanted to indie pub those books. So she actually wrote, I think it was the first 5 before she ever announced that she was doing a series, before she had the website up, so that she could release those first 5 just a few months apart. So her intention really was, you'd read book 1 and be like, oh, that was sweet and adorable. And boom, right away, she was able to be like, did you like that? Well, guess what? There's another one. And then boom, right away, there was another book. And so she was building, and in fact has been building momentum. So of course now it's driving her crazy because she's caught up and she's now having to write lickety split. But you'll also see that a lot with people who are in traditional romance. Because romance, the expectation is that those books are coming out fairly tight to each other. So you'll see writers either sometimes writing ahead or having harnessed whatever they can do to write as fast as they can. So those are a lot of deep thoughts on writing that. So I'm curious if anyone has any questions or comments or things that they were thinking about with that. Or not. All right, Cynthia, go ahead.
So, Eileen, I thought that was really helpful how you broke down the 3 ways to organize multiple books and the examples that you used. I do like, from what I'm writing, the second option, which was that each book is kind of a standalone story. But I have to say, when I started writing it, I wasn't really thinking about the commercial parameters. And I don't know if Bonnie, with an E, oh, the other Bonnie's gone. I don't know if Bonnie is giving any thought to that at all. I think when you're just in the throes of writing, that may not be a consideration. But I have a friend who has a trilogy, and each of the books is huge and cumbersome, and he's finding it really a challenge to find a buyer for it. And the idea for him of having to go through and pare it down is, I think, yeah, it's more than he can bear. So I think he's going to figure out how to approach it. But anyway, I wanted to just say that I hadn't really considered those 3 sort of solid options before. And it just was like an aha for me, like, yeah, this is a really good way to look at it, because my story about Max is not the only thing I'm writing. So, I appreciated that. I just want to let you know. Good, good info. Yeah.
I like once in a while to say something useful. So thank you, Cynthia. Yeah, I think you don't have to think about the commercial parts of a book when you're writing. When that comes in is when you start pitching and selling. Other than, I think there is some value in understanding the market. And I say this as someone of, do what I say, not what I did. So when I wrote my first book and was taking out Unpredictable, I did not know the publishing industry at all. I had a vague, I knew that you needed an agent, but I didn't really know, how hard is it to get one of those? I wonder. I didn't really know how challenging that was going to be. I didn't really understand kind of how publishing worked. So Cynthia, in terms of the friend you're talking about, even if he could get it down to 2 books, it would be more commercially, potentially viable, in that for the publisher to agree to 2 books is a lesser commitment for them than 3 books. And they don't like to do the first 2 if they're not going to do the whole thing. The other thing is, and this is just random advice, but I can give it, so I will. If for your friend, or for anyone actually here, if you're writing a series, it is not uncommon that the publisher may only agree to buy the first book in the series. So it's all sort of known. I'm buying this book, and if this book does well, then I'm very interested in books 2 and 3. But they have not committed to books 2 and 3. What you will want to do if you have an agent, they'll take care of this. But if you don't have an agent, make sure that it's crystal clear that if they don't pick up the option for that, that you can write that book for anyone else. Right? So you don't want a situation where they're saying like, well, we published this, and so you know, if you're doing books 2 and 3, it's either with us or it's not happening. Because, for example, your friend Cynthia might want to say he sells book 1 and it does okay, but not great. And so the publisher's like, nah, but he's like, you know what? I could publish book 2 and 3 myself, indie publish it. He wants to just make sure that it's clear that he can, in fact, do that.
And does that come in your contract? Is that just something you negotiate? Do they have, I mean, is there sort of an industry minimum in terms of sales that they target with? There's no.
Because it's partly going to be tied to your advance, right? So if your publisher gives you $10,000 and your book sells 8,000 copies, they've actually done pretty well. Like, keep in mind, they're keeping half. So if your book, we're going to make the math really easy, right? So we're going to say that your book costs $10. So the publisher is getting $5 for every book that you sell. So if you sell 10,000 copies, they've made their money back, enough to pay you and, you know, for their sales and kind of overhead costs. Now, if that book sold 100,000 copies, they are so very happy with you. And you can guarantee your next contract will be for more money, right? But that's just laughing all the way to the bank. On the other hand, I've known people who have sold 200, 300,000 copies, but their book itself, they had sold for such a large advance that from the publisher's perspective, this was not as successful. So you may have a situation where I may have sold less books than Leslie, but my publisher may be happier with me because the cost of doing mine was so much less than it was of doing Leslie's. So even though if we were just looking at straight sales numbers, she won. There's a win with that, right? She had a higher number than I did. How that's interpreted within the house is going to make a difference. And it also depends on your country, right? So, for example, if you're with a Canadian publisher, Canada is a much smaller market than the States. So the number that most commonly gets banded around is if you sell 5,000 copies in Canada, that you're considered a bestseller within Canada. 5,000 copies in the States, that's a drop in the bucket. Now, if you did that all in 1 week, they'd be super happy with that. But yeah, otherwise, 5,000 copies isn't necessarily a big sell-through. So, Bonnie, how does that help or make things worse for you?
Well, it helps. I had already planned out the other 2 books that I was going to write, and there was a potential for a 4th. But spoiler alert, Sari gets her own book. But yeah, I still have to tussle with it. My gut feeling is that I should keep it as 1 book. But I can maybe cut down some of the, one of the subplots that I was hoping to develop, and I could hint at it, but not develop it so much, so that in the 2nd book, it could be a major plot.
Yeah.
It's one option. But I tend to like to write in a world with different characters, and I'm very partial to books where, like in romance, where it's a family of characters. So book 1 will have Jake and Raleigh. Sorry.
Sure, I'll go with that.
Jake and Rhonda and their best friends, Carl and Megan. And then the next one has Carl and Megan and, the brother and his issue. And then the 3rd book is the brother and his. I like it's what do they call them? Loosely connected.
Yeah.
And the main characters still show up, but they're not driving the story as much. I just really like that.
And that's the fun as a reader when you read those series is, the character Bonnie shows up in book 3 and you know all about Bonnie because you remember book 1. But if someone was starting with book 3 and they don't know Bonnie, it doesn't matter. Like their enjoyment of that book is in no way really influenced, other than hopefully they're tempted when they realize like, oh, Bonnie had her own story. I'm going back to read that one now. I want to know that story. So that will make a difference. I think the most useful thing you can do, Bonnie, is sit down, since you have the 3 books already kind of loosely
planned
out as you're going. Start thinking about, like, does this scene need to be in this book, or could it go in this, like if Sari's going to get her own story, you know, maybe some of these scenes show up in that other book as a flashback or a reference point or something else that she's doing, and they don't need to be in this book.
Yeah.
So that may help.
That probably is. The other series related question of my 2 series, one is the way Bonnie was just describing, where the characters kind of roll over in a loose chain, so that it's kind of like an epilogue in the sense that readers of romance kind of want to know what happens after the happily ever after. And it also creates a little bit of continuity in terms of world building. Mm-hmm. But my other series is linked only, I don't even know whether to call it thematically, but there's no carryover of character or setting or plot. It's just the idea of a series of books about young women in a kind of situation. And there's a parallel between each of the books in the series. And somebody in a marketing context said, well, that's not even a series. So I don't know, is that just a branding thing? I mean, how do I market that differently?
Leave it to you, Marianne, to have a challenging question. I'm only 1 cup of tea in, woman. All right. So what I would say is, I don't know if I would define that as a series. I would define it more as a way that you're branding and marketing those. So this is a series of books about life after divorce. And book 1 is about Susan's life, and book 2 is about Megan's, and book 3 is about Carl's. And so these characters don't have anything together, but this is a series of books of people all dealing with this one issue. And that tends to become like, it would be a marketing thing that I would think would be more than a series, because series, again, I think is going to come into one of those 3 things. It's either one story divided into larger pieces, right? So a Game of Thrones kind of thing, or it's individual adventures like a murder mystery. So A is for alibi, B is for burglar, or C being that kind of, which this almost touches on, but isn't quite there, where there's some kind of thematic world. So these are different characters within that world, or different parts or time periods in that world. So if you like Ken Follett's series, there's, you know, he does like all the way through World War I and II is one of the series. So there's different characters, but it's all the same family. Like the books reference each other. So it's
the family. The family is the link.
Yeah.
Even
the families
on different time periods and events.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I would see yours more as a branding. Leslie has a thought.
I have a thought. I have a question about a story that I'm working on now, and it's I guess probably you'd call it a duology, because the first one is going to have a satisfying conclusion, but it's not over. So the second book is going to have its own story arc, but it is dependent on the first book, because I'm not sure. I mean, like, I don't know. Can you start a book that starts with characters already? So they've finished this arc and now they have to do something else. Is like, how do you handle that? Because I guess it is a standalone story, but perhaps it's not. The first one is, but
no. I mean, I definitely think it. And a lot of series are not standalone books. So the Game of Thrones are not standalone books. You can't buy book 4 in Game of Thrones and be like, that was really enjoyable. So if you haven't read book 1 through 3, you're going to be utterly confused and have no idea what's happening. So you're reading that. And again, that's obviously, I think it's 7 or 9 books, or however long that series will eventually be. But you'll see a lot of duology or a 3-part series where this full story isn't completed until book 3, but you're not reading book 2 or 3 if you haven't read book 1.
Okay. All right.
That's completely fine and normal. So it doesn't have to be standalone. And both, in terms of like commercial issues, if you're worried about that, both are extremely popular. So I have definitely seen both of those. Kristen, you have a thought.
That reminds me, actually, the middle grade, there's The War That Saved My Life, and then The War I Finally Won. And it's the same characters, and it's actually a very tight timeline. These kids are evacuated from London. They come from an abusive situation, and so you see all that, and then there's all the stuff going on within this village, and then there's like at the end they're bombed, and you end the first story and you don't know who's alive, who's dead, or anything. And then the next book kind of picks up right where that left off. And then you see the aftermath, and then the story moves forward and some new elements are added. But yeah, it's very much, and I imagine it was probably split into two because it's middle grade. And it would have been too long of a story just in one go for most middle grade readers. But the first section she won the big award with it.
Newbery?
So, I think it was either a nominee or a winner.
Yeah.
It was part of a reading thing my kids did. But yeah, both, it's an amazing story, and it really ended like cliffhanger, which I thought was a bold choice for middle grade reader.
Yeah, I mean, I would say in general, you're usually often ending with some type of cliffhanger. There's something that's pulling the reader into book 2 or 3 or whatever, but you still want to make sure you have something that's gotten resolved so that it feels not like, I don't know if you've ever had, this has only happened to me once, but once I bought a book and I was reading along and I turned the page and it was like, I kept thinking like, how is the author, like I only have so many pages left. How's the author ever going to wrap this all up? And it was some kind of misprint. Like they just didn't give me the last 30 pages of the book. Like, so all of a sudden I was like, well, like at first I was like, how can anyone end a book like that? Like that's not an ending. And then I found it actually wasn't the ending. There was like another 30 pages and Chapters was lovely. They gave me another copy. It was all worked out fine. But you don't want to give the reader that feeling that they got a misprint, that, that they turning the page and it's like there should be something here. So that there is a sense that there is some kind of resolution, even if there is a large cliffhanger happening at that moment where you don't know exactly how that's going to resolve. Questions on anything with our last couple of minutes that people are struggling with this week? Anything that people want to make sure we tackle next Tuesday? And if you think of it in the next few days, you can let me know. But otherwise, you're stuck. I will pick something. And I will be tackling that. And again, if people have query letters or anything, synopsis or things they want people to look at, we can do that. Bonnie, if you ever wanted to run plot points past someone, that's also, I think it can be nice if you want to get other people's feedback on that as well. Always feel free. That's not just for Bonnie. It wasn't just special Bonnie. It's everyone. If you're struggling with plotting and sort of wanting to talk through, I'm not sure if the character should do A or B, we will certainly have thoughts and opinions. Marianne, I think you had actually going, and I can't remember if you got answers, like you had questions about if a character should have a romance with someone else.
Yeah, and we had a brief discussion about it in the romance thread.
Yeah.
And it was frustrating because I'm not technically writing pure romance. I'm writing romantic women's fiction, and so I often tackle more complicated relationship issues and more realistic, plot elements. So the question was, my character sort of stages a fake romance with this. It's almost like Cyrano de Bergerac type of thing. My character stages a fake romance with this character who's really, really painfully shy and being bullied in order to give him confidence and sort of shift his public persona in this little village. And they become very close. She's staying with him, and he's he's like a 30-year-old virgin, and she wants to sort of help him with a little bit of friendly sex therapy, kind of a friends with benefit thing, no strings attached. She's leaving town. She knows he's in love with this other woman. It's like they're cool with it. And in my original story, I wrote it through that they actually had a very brief fling. And then the story moved on, and she's actually getting involved with somebody else while he works out his issues. And the strict romance response was, you can't do that.
Yeah.
Right. But I'm not really writing romance. So I had to ask myself if I really cared. Donna, who's a bit of a rebel and not a romance reader, she thought it was fine. And she's looking forward to reading this story. So I don't know who I'm appealing to, or if I, I have the publisher hat on so it's really hard to write a story without thinking, well, is this going to bomb because I'm going to offend all these purists out there? But then I've never been a purist, and I've never been trying to appease that market anyway. So that was my dilemma. Should I do it the way I originally planned and whatever happens?
I would actually say there are two separate questions that you're asking.
Yeah.
So the first is, what do people think of that as sort of a plot or a storyline? And I mean, speaking for myself, I think that's interesting and complicated and no doubt going to be messy, also possibly exciting, sort of fun, it could be humorous. Like I can see a lot of different ways to take that I would find very enjoyable. The second thing is around the mistress of conflict. I love me some conflict. Like, yay, that's going to cause trouble. So I love that complication. Having said that, if you are marketing and selling to a more traditional romance market, I would back down where maybe she, gives him some kissing tips and that's it.
Yeah.
And that has to do with reader expectations, which is readers who are, rabid fans of traditional romance. There are certain things they're going to expect. In the same way, you couldn't end without a happily ever after. Like the couple would have to end up together. Like you could be like, and then she realized he was a jackass and went and lived on her own and was perfectly happy without a man. Like if you had that in a romance book at the very end, people would be like, well, wait a minute. Like that's not how these end. So it becomes that.
Yeah. Well, I'm encouraged that this group is actually, intrigued and supportive of that idea, because it is, from my storytelling perspective, it works because there are layers of issues about people's issues and their backstory and how this plays into their growth. And it also increases the conflict between both the actual couples who were trying to, work stuff out. And so from a women's fiction perspective, it works for me. And I've never been interested in conforming to the romance genre parameters. I've always pushed at the edges and rebelled against that. And I really don't think I care.
All that comes down to is then deciding when it comes time to send this book out, to be, and I don't know how much say you have over the cover or the back copy blurb or those kinds of things.
I'm the boss.
Oh, okay. Well, then you got a lot. Then you make sure that this book is being marketed so that it's clear that it's women's fiction. Like when I pick up a book by, for example, Leanne Moriarty, who wrote Pretty Big Lies and some of those, like I expect complicated relationships. I expect those things. But if you have a cover where it's a couple, and I'm going over the top cliche, but in the the clunch, like mwah, mwah, like, and I'm thinking, okay, this is going to be a romance book, and I open it up and it's not a romance book, I'm going to be upset.
Yeah, I don't put couples on the cover because it's always more about the individual story.
Yeah,
character arcs.
It's making sure that you're making that marketing and the branding really clear. Because to me, the example would be, and I've used this before with you guys, but if I say, open your mouth and I put in a spoonful and I tell you it's going to be pudding and it's actually gravy, there's going to be a moment where you're going to be like, because you thought I was going to give you pudding. And it might be the best gravy on the planet, but if you are expecting it to be pudding, you're not going to be happy. So it's going to be about branding and marketing.
And from that perspective, even though my brand is kind of slightly reckless, rebellious women's fiction. It's very romantic, but it's messy, and I break rules, and I'm not a purist in terms of any kind of moral. Like it's real life. People do stuff, even if they think it's wrong, they still do it. So that's the way I write, right?
Then I would just make sure like the back copy blurb and those kinds of things focus on the main character and less on the romance angle.
Right. So because I'm talking about a little bit about in the blurb about how my character gets involved in this relationship with this other guy, Crystal felt that it was important to at least hint at with the language the fact that it actually becomes a sexual relationship, even if I don't spell that out. Yeah. Just to get clear on
it's gravy.
That it's gravy and not pudding. Yeah, for those, particularly for those that, for their own reasons, are going to get all bent out of shape about that.
Yeah.
Because that's fine. They can go read romance. I don't care.
Yeah. Like there are a lot of people who aren't going to like what you write because they're strict pudding people.
Yeah.
Pudding vegans or whatever. Like they don't eat gravy. But that doesn't mean there isn't a huge market for the other people. So that's what you need to do. So if you're open, we would always be happy in this little session to help you find out a back copy blurb. So if you have a couple different versions and you want feedback, we'd be happy to do that. I'd make a note for yourself of some of the things. Like I think you got some nice comments in here around like challenging stereotypes and stuff. I think that's useful. All right.
I just screenshotted it.
There you go. Whatever gets you through the next day. All right. So everyone, we are at 10 o'clock. So I want to thank everybody for coming today. If you have any questions, you can always reach me on Blip and via email. If you have something you'd like to tackle next week for Tuesday's session, let me know. Otherwise, I will come prepared. And for everyone else, have a great week.
Thank you very much.